So welcome everyone. So you probably know the title of the talk. So just a little context about me. I worked mostly as a software developer in several industries, I can say. The last one was Estimate, which is Internet of Things startup which specializes in location indoors. So they own devices called beacons to position people indoors. And the previous companies were about healthcare, like Harimata, which detects early signs of autism in children, and some finance or sales-related startups. So at the beginning, small disclaimer, especially after adding GDPR to the talk title and after yesterday's talk. So it's not fully, it's not official legal advice for companies. It's more about best practices for developers who actually do the work. And if you need specific answers for your company problems, I think from my experience and experience from my colleagues from the industry, that you probably already have some friend who's a legal person or a lawyer, and they probably know the details of the GDPR regulation. And another thing that maybe you wonder is we had GDPR talk yesterday, which was great. So why another one? Isn't duplication? But no, this one is more low level and more about how those things that happened or were regulated at the top translate to your daily workflow, and how you can apply best practices so the amount of the work you need to do to achieve full compliance is minimized. So in computer science, everything is about optimization. So here we optimize about us developers or data scientists. So at the beginning, short, why developers should care about GDPR, because all those big fines and restrictions are about companies, so why should I even care about that? And I think that it's more about personal responsibility, about how do you feel about your work, if the code you produce and ship is like ethically okay. And the another reason is more practical. At some point, your boss can give you the task, okay, we need to be compliant to operate, continue our operations. So you actually can be in a situation where you are forced to do those things. So it's better to be prepared. And sometimes I heard when all that hype about GDPR started in last month, and all that it was shown in the media and in the press that it's a big thing, but the regulation was finalized 2 years ago, so we all had time. But still, sometimes I heard like excuses why not to change anything for better. And the first was, that's not my problem as a developer. I will wait till the boss or the manager gives me the task to change some things. But as I said, if you start early, you have less work to do later. Another excuse and like workaround, which sometimes may work, but in most cases I think it's not a good idea, is to reject European Union residents as clients, so you technically don't need to comply with the regulation, but actually finding who's the European Union resident from your clients is additional big task, and it's not so easy to figure out who should be treated as a European citizen, who not. And it's additional big amount of work, so maybe it's better to stay with your user base, but just do the things better. Another is that we should postpone making changes until we are notified that we are not compliant, and we will be forced legally to make some changes. And again, I think that it's better to not to wait, but to change things step by step, to not be overflown with the amount of work that needs to be done. And some markets require additional care. So if you work, for example, for healthcare, you probably are already familiar with the standards. And if you want to operate on, for example, German or American market, you need to comply with the standards. And those standards are sometimes even more restricted than GDPR. So it's actually legally required if you want to do business for healthcare with the, for example, with the clinics, to operate on a high level of transparency and security and privacy. And another tricky market is IoT. So in IoT, maybe it's not so regulated as a healthcare, but it provides you with such big amount of data about the users that you actually have a choice to, if you want to do something like more transparent with that, or if you want to use all the data and maybe build the products that are not so well communicated to users and actually uses the data that shouldn't be used. For example, about people location. So until I go further, I wanted to just introduce you 4 key terms used when we talk about GDPR. It's data subject, so it's actually every one of us as a user, because we produce the data in all the systems we use and the products. So actually, everything we do as a developers may affect ourselves. Personal data. That was kind of a surprise for me that at the beginning, when I was reading about GDPR, I was thinking that personal data is only about healthcare records or some salary details, but it may be things about behavior at work, some preferences when you browse the internet. So actually, it's way more broad term than you can think at the beginning. So it's worth to think twice about storing something, because you may think, okay, but who cares if I track the users, which products user browse in my system, because that's not personal data. But it actually may be in the definition. The data controller can be company or institution that actually owns the the data at the end stores the information or uses this personal data to build products or services for end users. And the second like institution or company that may work with the data is data processor. Sometimes if you, for example, use some mailing services or use external databases or some platform as a service, so those companies became data processors. So they process the data for the data controller. And the two most important scenarios we need to consider when we think about protection of privacy is profiling. So you probably know the term. It's about connecting the specific person, the data subject, with some analytics or information about him, and some might be inputted to the system by the user, but some might be calculated with, for example, machine learning to, for example, calculate the likelihood of conversion in some sales system or likelihood of disease in healthcare system. So most of our industry machine learning models profile the users and enhance them with additional metadata. And sometimes we use those results to build automated decision making, things like recommendation system or some ranking system. And it may use profiling, but it doesn't have to. And the second thing, I think it's even more important to comply, and I will cover the topic a little bit later. Okay, so if I need to say what's like general rule to follow in order to minimize the work of needed to be done to comply is it's about consent and transparency. So the first one, it's about asking the user if he actually wants to allow the company to process the data they want. And you probably received a lot of emails about giving consent for newsletters and things like this, so you know the idea. But I think that the consent should always go with transparency. So if you ask the user about some rights or about some data, you should be transparent and clear about what will actually happen or what you want to achieve, and not hide the true goal behind some like fuzzy or complicated legal language. So let's jump into best practices. So the first one is anonymization, and it's all about that if you remove the user from the data, and you are sure that it's not possible to identify the information about gathered information with the user they belong, you may use it. It's in details it's a little bit more complicated. But as general rule, if you see that it's not necessary to connect the data points with the specific person, you can remove that connection as soon as possible, maybe in the mobile app or on the data collection steps. And or add some middleware that ensures that some specific connection between data points or some specific data it's actually not collected or not connected. So it's, as we yesterday heard, sometimes it's even wise to just remove the data you don't need and you know that you will not use, to not think later, okay, how securely should I store some personal information that actually my business don't need. So if it's less unused or unimportant data, there is less stress about how to process and store it securely later. And we go to documentation. I know that probably most of you don't like writing documentation. I personally had the same experience. But at some point, I discovered that actually it's a great tool for communication between the team members of projects, and it helps not only to say for the future how the things were developed, but it helps with things like introducing new team members to the project. And for example, in healthcare, you actually are obligated to document most part of the process. So it's not something that you can hide from. So it's better to do it smart. So what should you document if you are doing some machine learning project? So first thing is data sets. So if you collect data for training, validation, or testing, it's wise to collect as much metadata about this collection process as possible, and usually in some predefined format. So it's good if you have a team, it's good to meet at the beginning of the project and build some guidelines about documenting the data sets and the rest part of the system. So it's not consistent across the another iterations, and you can compare data sets from different phases of the project. And it's important if you collect, for example, data from the users to also be sure that you respect their privacy. And if I said that you should collect as much metadata as possible, but use common sense and think what may be treated as a personal data. Another one is documentation of models and parameters. So according to GDPR, sometimes it may happen situation where you need to explain the user how some decision was made. And the first thing to start with is to actually know which model was used with parameters. And without writing documentation on each step or through the whole project, it may be really, really hard. Sometimes the team members of the team who build it are no longer in the company or in the project or just forgot. So it's wise to have track of the details of the models we use. And not only the machine learning models, but the whole pipeline. So if you move data from data store to machine learning server or service, and then move the results to another database, it's important to document how that flow went. So you by building this documentation of data pipeline, you actually see another important thing is it's where the data goes and which external services uses or help you process the data, because they also need to comply. So you need to be sure that if you, for example, at the end use some mailing service to send the results or some information to users, you will when making that documentation, you will see that, okay, now it's time to check if this mailing service is GDPR compliant. Yeah, so external services mostly behave as data controllers, and it's important to choose the ones who already comply. I think that most external third-party services use GDPR now as a marketing tool, so they like to tell you, okay, we are safe, secure, and GDPR compliant, so it's not so hard to be sure. And another thing is data pipelines. So after we have everything documented, and if the user wants to know why decision, for example, about credit score or some health diagnosis, how it happened, sometimes they can say, okay, but I refuse, I don't no longer give you consent to use my data, or I want to modify some parts of information you have about me, or I want to modify everything. So documentation is not something that will make it, it will make easier to know what should be changed. But if you don't have well-automated data pipelines and processes, this situation can be really hard for your business. So what I would suggest is to be prepared from the beginning that such things like modification of users' personal data, or sometimes just even removal of some subsets of the users from your model is possible, and it's one of the scenarios. So when the situation happens in the real life, you have all the things automated and prepared, so it's not something that will break your company operations for some weeks or months. So as I said, automation is the key for that. If you are software developers, you probably already are familiar with the systems like continuous integration, and your shipping process is automated maybe to just writing one line of command in terminal in order to go through each step. But as maybe as a data scientist or more research person, you in the past you did these steps manually, and it won't scale so easily. So try to, if you for example making project from the scratch, think after each step you make, think, okay, can I just pack it into the script or other piece of code that can be easily run by somebody else, or can be connected with other scripts I wrote in the past. So the whole process of relearning or data import is automated. And as I said, it's important to make it early. Even if you are doing some proof of concept, from my experience, after showing successful proof of concept of a machine learning project or even a regular software development project to my boss, the first thing that comes from him is, okay, if it works, let's just put it on production as soon as possible. And so when you are doing proof of concept, you may think, okay, we will write it from the scratch if it's successful, or we will brainstorm how to do it better. But for your boss, it's not. It can be a different perspective. So if at this step of showing the results, you already have those automated pipelines ready, it will be easier to go with production. Okay, and another thing is that sometimes it's better to go start with simple models. So you probably knew everything about deep neural networks and other black box solutions, but in case when user will come to you and he will want answers for the question why I was refused of getting a credit or mortgage, or why I got this diagnosis in your system, or why system said that I'm healthy and later I got sick. And to answer those questions about why, with complicated models like deep neural networks, it's very hard to provide those answers, and so you should be sure of what's the thing that you want to optimize, if it's accuracy or its interpretability. And sometimes, or maybe in most cases, it's better to make a model that behaves a little, that performs a little bit lower, but you actually can say what's happening under the mask, or you can minimize this black box part of the system. Okay, and the last part is about more ethical approach. So what GDPR tries to minimize is also the risk of bias. And so how you check if the output of your model, of your product, is fair for all the users, or how you check if it's not unfair in some edge cases. So the answer for that would be to provide some testing data. For example, if you do project which use personal information of patients, be sure that it's not only trained for a specific group of, for example, white male patients, but the group is diversified because end users are diversified, and in solutions like, for example, credit scoring, be sure that things like, for example, zip code, it's not correlated with, can sometimes correlate with some factors like, for example, race, and be sure that those correlations don't happen in your system, because sometimes even if you remove things that you shouldn't analyze, some other data can lead to that. So it's wise to sometimes sit and brainstorm. Okay, if it's really if we really protect those people. Okay, and the last advice, which I saw especially when working with business people, is to not ignore domain experts. So I know that end-to-end machine learning models could be really efficient, but it's still good to consult the possible outputs and to learn more about what data is collected from the people who work with that. So to give you an example, if you work on some sales software and want to build lead qualification system, so you want to score your customers of how big is the chance of making a good deal with them. I personally saw that when I started talking with salespeople who work with the clients directly, they had some intuitions and some informations for me that showed me that, okay, those are features that I should look on. But from other side, they also provide some insight about, okay, but if we use this data, it's probably not so okay to make decisions based on, for example, some employee information, because that, from their perspective, it's not another data point. It's something that they can see that they don't want to be used on them. So we shouldn't build a system that uses this data points. Okay, that's all. If you have some more specific questions, I would like to.
Thank you very much, Łukasz. Very interesting, which you always say, of course, after a talk, but specifically, you know, if you have any questions, I would have one, but I'll let you first ask questions. Anyone? Can't see any. Oh, there.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. The question I have is, when you start collecting data and not yet have a model in place, you don't know which data you will need in order to fit the model properly. So there's a trade-off between not collecting the data and collecting the maximum data, because you don't know which one will be the appropriate one. So how to fix this looking into the future?
Okay, so from my experience, I would say that the first thing is, if you want to collect that, if that data contains personal information about the users, the first wise things to do is to actually tell the user that you will collect it, and try to also communicate that it may be used later to do some things that what you want to build, but you don't know yet what's required, so which data point. Another thing is you probably, when you collect that data, you probably have some end product in mind. So still, I think that there are things that you, with common sense, you think that will not play the role. And if they are like some personal things, you would need to use the common sense to provide yourself answer. Okay, I think that I'm building some recommendation system, but that data about health is not necessary. Yeah, it's hard to, if you want to make something innovative, it's hard to know if maybe that health data is good proxy to give better results. But then I would go with the full transparency to the users. So I would say, okay, there's something that can be built that can help you with this information, but you need to be aware that I collect it and I will use it in the future. It's the best answer is try not to hide the things.
Thank you.
Anyone else? So a short question from me. You touched upon the topic of documentation. Now, my experience is that obviously the documentation varies with regard to who is going to be the recipient of it. Do you have any best practices in how you structure the documentation in a way which enables then more transparency in explaining the model?
I have experience with two types of such documentation. The first one was did for healthcare certification audits, and it required a lot of diagrams and visual explanations of how the system works. And another one was more internal. And it was more about how to conduct the experiments and how to present the results as well. So your question is can you?
So there's a different level of depth for documentation when you do it, and obviously when you want to maintain the maintain explainability or transparency of your model, you probably need to structure documentation differently too, right? Yes.
So I think that it's important to have the template of the documentation at the beginning. And for example, for an internal documentation, we also had a template of showing the results and some restrictions or some suggestions of how to, for example, if you provide some visualization or charts, what we also tried to apply some external best practices of how to present the visualizations. So I would say that it's it varies in each case. But if you have a team, you should just talk at the beginning of building that templates. So later, when, for example, another person joins the team, and his or she is not used to writing the docs, it's easier for them to write it properly, and you minimize the amount of work to be done, because if you are, like me, developer, that it's not his, I'm not good at writing long piece of text, but if I have the template that I need to only fill in, for example, about the experiment, which data was used, and I know that, okay, I need to present the result in such way, I need to provide those parameters, it's way easier.
Thank you very much. So again, thank you very much, Łukasz. And we're going to have a changeover now with Omar joining us. So 3 minutes and we start another talk. Thanks again.